One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung. Have you ever noticed how the people who irritate you most seem to possess the exact qualities you despise? That coworker who's always seeking attention, that friend who never takes responsibility, that family member who's constantly playing the victim. You see them clearly, you judge them harshly, you wonder how they can be so blind to their own behavior. But what if I told you that your irritation is a mirror? What if the traits that trigger you most violently are the very aspects of yourself you've spent years trying to deny, suppress, and hide from the world? This isn't comfortable to hear. Your mind is probably already forming protests, creating lists of how you're different, how you're better, how you would never act that way. That resistance you're feeling right now, that's your shadow speaking. Carl Jung, one of the greatest scholars of the human mind, understood something profound about human nature that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. He knew that every person carries within them a shadow, those parts of ourselves we've deemed unacceptable, shameful, or wrong. These aren't just negative traits. They're pieces of our authentic selves that we've amputated because somewhere along the way we learned they weren't safe to express. Your shadow doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It doesn't fade when you pretend it doesn't exist. Instead, it grows stronger in the darkness of your unconscious mind, pulling strings you can't see, driving behaviors you can't understand, and creating patterns you can't break. Think about the last time you had a strong emotional reaction to someone. Not mild annoyance, but real anger, disgust, or judgment. What exactly triggered you? Was it their arrogance, their neediness, their refusal to take responsibility, their desperate need for validation? Now ask yourself this: when was the last time you exhibited that same behavior, even in a small way? When did you last seek attention, avoid responsibility, or need validation? When did you last act from a place of arrogance or desperation, even if you justified it differently? Your shadow is everything you've decided you're not allowed to be. It's the anger you've never expressed, the needs you've never acknowledged, the desires you've never admitted, the fears you've never faced. It's every part of yourself you've rejected in order to be accepted by others. But here's what Jung discovered. Your shadow doesn't just contain your worst qualities. It also holds your greatest power, your deepest creativity, and your most authentic self. When you reject parts of yourself, you don't just lose the negative aspects. You lose access to the energy, the passion, and the vitality that comes with those rejected parts. This is why you feel exhausted trying to be perfect. This is why you feel like you're wearing a mask that never quite fits. This is why you feel disconnected from your own life, watching it happen from the outside rather than living it from within. Your shadow is running your life from behind the scenes, and you don't even know it. Every time you judge someone harshly, your shadow is speaking. Every time you have a disproportionate emotional reaction, your shadow is activated. Every time you find yourself in the same painful patterns, despite your best efforts to change, your shadow is in control. The person who triggers your anger about their attention-seeking behavior is showing you the part of yourself that desperately wants to be seen, but has learned it's not safe to ask directly. The person whose neediness disgusts you is reflecting back your own unmet needs that you've buried so deep you've forgotten they exist. The person whose arrogance infuriates you is mirroring the part of yourself that knows your worth but has learned to hide it behind false humility. This is called projection, and it's one of the most powerful mechanisms your unconscious mind uses to show you what you can't see about yourself. Carl Jung understood that we don't see people as they are, we see them through the lens of our own unconscious material. The qualities that trigger us most strongly in others are almost always the qualities we've disowned in ourselves. But projection isn't just about negative traits. You also project your disowned positive qualities onto others. That person you admire for their confidence, you're seeing your own confidence that you've learned to suppress. That person you respect for their creativity, you're witnessing your own creative potential that you've abandoned. That person you envy for their success, you're looking at your own capability that you've convinced yourself you don't possess. Your shadow contains both your rejected darkness and your disowned light. It holds your capacity for anger and your capacity for joy. It contains your selfishness and your generosity, your cruelty and your compassion, your weakness and your strength. These aren't separate aspects. They're different faces of the same energy. When you deny your anger, you also lose access to your ability to set boundaries. When you reject your selfishness, you lose touch with your legitimate needs. When you disown your arrogance, you disconnect from your natural confidence. When you suppress your neediness, you cut yourself off from your capacity for intimacy and connection. This is why trying to be good all the time leaves you feeling empty. This is why always being nice makes you feel invisible. This is why constantly helping others while ignoring your own needs leads to resentment and burnout. You're not living as a whole person. You're living as a carefully constructed persona designed to be acceptable to others. Your persona is the mask you wear in the world, the image you present to gain approval and avoid rejection. It's not necessarily false, but it's incomplete. It's only the parts of yourself you've deemed safe to show. Meanwhile, your shadow contains everything your persona excludes, all the messy, complicated, authentic parts of who you really are. The tragedy is that in trying to be perfect, you've made yourself predictable. In trying to be good, you've lost your edge. In trying to be acceptable, you've become a pale imitation of your true self. You've traded your authenticity for approval, your power for acceptance, your aliveness for safety. But your shadow is always trying to return to consciousness. It shows up in your dreams, your fantasies, your slips of the tongue, your sudden emotional reactions, and your repetitive patterns. It's the part of you that comes out when you're drunk, exhausted, or stressed. It's the voice in your head that says things you would never say out loud. It's the impulse you have to do things you would never actually do. Your shadow is also active in your relationships. You unconsciously choose partners who carry the shadow qualities you've rejected in yourself. You're attracted to people who express what you've suppressed. Then you either try to change them or eventually reject them for the very qualities that drew you to them in the first place. This is why your relationships often feel like battlefields. You're not just fighting with your partner, you're fighting with the parts of yourself you see reflected in them. You're trying to control in them what you can't control in yourself. You're judging in them what you can't accept in yourself. The same pattern plays out in your relationship with yourself. You're constantly at war with your own impulses, your own needs, your own authentic responses. You've internalized the voices of everyone who ever told you that certain parts of yourself were wrong, bad, or unacceptable. Now you police yourself more harshly than anyone else ever could. But what if those parts of yourself aren't wrong? What if they're just human? What if your anger is actually your life force trying to protect your boundaries? What if your neediness is actually your heart calling for connection? What if your selfishness is actually your survival instinct trying to ensure your needs are met? Carl Jung believed that the shadow isn't evil, it's simply unconscious. It becomes problematic only when it's rejected and denied. When you bring your shadow into consciousness, when you acknowledge and integrate these disowned parts of yourself, they transform from destructive forces into sources of power and authenticity. This is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole. It's not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming complete. It's about reclaiming all the parts of yourself you've scattered in the name of acceptance and approval. The signs that your shadow is dominating your life are everywhere once you know how to look. You find yourself repeatedly triggered by the same types of people. You notice patterns in your relationships that you can't seem to break. You feel exhausted by the effort of maintaining your image. You sense that you're living someone else's life rather than your own. You have strong opinions about how other people should behave, but you struggle to understand your own motivations. You find yourself doing things you said you'd never do, or failing to do things you know you should do. You feel like there's a part of you that's always watching, always judging, always trying to control how you appear to others. These aren't character flaws, they're symptoms of shadow domination. They're signs that you've split yourself in half, accepting only the parts that feel safe, while rejecting the parts that feel dangerous. But wholeness requires integration, not amputation. Your shadow holds the key to your freedom, but only if you're willing to face what you've been avoiding, only if you're willing to see what you've been denying, only if you're willing to own what you've been projecting onto others. The path forward isn't about eliminating your shadow, it's about befriending it. It's about understanding that your completeness includes your contradictions, your authenticity includes your flaws, and your power includes your vulnerability. This recognition is just the beginning. Once you start to see how your shadow operates, once you begin to notice the ways it's been controlling your life from behind the scenes, you can start the process of integration. You can begin to reclaim the parts of yourself you've lost, to heal the splits you've created, and to live as the whole, authentic person you were meant to be. But first, you have to be willing to look. You have to be willing to see yourself clearly, without the filters of judgment and denial that have kept you safe but small. You have to be willing to admit that the very traits you despise in others might be the key to understanding yourself. Your shadow is not your enemy. It's your teacher, your guide, and ultimately, your path to freedom. But it can only serve these functions if you're brave enough to turn toward it instead of away from it. The moment you begin to see your shadow's influence, something extraordinary happens. The world becomes a different place. Not because anything external has changed, but because you're finally seeing clearly for the first time in years. That coworker who always irritated you with their need for attention, you suddenly recognize the desperate child inside yourself who learned that being seen was dangerous. That friend whose constant complaining used to drive you crazy, you see your own unexpressed frustration that you've been swallowing for decades. That family member whose victim mentality made you furious, you witness your own powerlessness that you've been denying behind a mask of strength. This recognition isn't comfortable. Your mind will resist it with everything it has. It will create elaborate justifications for why you're different, why your situation is unique, why your behavior is justified while theirs is not. This resistance is normal. It's your ego's desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of separation between you and them, between the acceptable you and the unacceptable you. But Jung understood that this resistance is actually a guardian at the threshold of transformation. Your psyche knows that once you truly see your shadow, once you acknowledge these rejected parts of yourself, there's no going back to the comfortable fiction of your carefully constructed persona. When you start to own your projections, when you begin to reclaim the parts of yourself you've been seeing in others, something remarkable occurs. The people who used to trigger you begin to lose their power over you, not because they've changed, but because you're no longer unconsciously battling with yourself through them. This is the beginning of psychological freedom, but it's also the beginning of a deeper responsibility. Once you can see your shadow operating, once you understand how projection works, you can no longer blame others for your emotional reactions. You can no longer pretend that your pain is entirely caused by external circumstances. Your emotional weather patterns start to make sense for the first time. Those sudden storms of anger that seem to come from nowhere, they're not random. They're your shadow's way of trying to get your attention, trying to show you something you need to see about yourself. Those moments of inexplicable sadness, those waves of anxiety that don't seem connected to anything specific, they're messages from the parts of yourself you've been ignoring. Carl Jung called emotions the language of the unconscious. Your feelings aren't just reactions to what's happening around you. They're communications from the depths of your psyche, trying to guide you toward wholeness. But you've been taught to manage your emotions rather than listen to them, to control them rather than understand them. When you feel triggered by someone, instead of immediately judging them or trying to change them, ask yourself, what part of myself am I seeing in this person? What am I refusing to acknowledge about my own nature? The answer might not come immediately. Your conscious mind is skilled at deflecting these inquiries, but if you keep asking, if you stay curious rather than defensive, the truth will eventually surface. Your shadow speaks through your body as well as your emotions. That tension in your shoulders when certain people are around, that's your body responding to shadow material. The knot in your stomach when you have to pretend to be someone you're not, that's your authentic self protesting the betrayal. The exhaustion you feel after social interactions where you've had to perform, that's the cost of maintaining your persona while suppressing your shadow. Integration doesn't mean acting out every shadow impulse. It means acknowledging these parts of yourself, understanding their origins, and finding healthy ways to honor their needs. The anger you've been suppressing might be trying to tell you that your boundaries are being violated. The neediness you've been ashamed of might be pointing toward your legitimate need for connection and support. The selfishness you've been judging might be your survival instinct trying to ensure your basic needs are met. Think about a time when you acted in a way that surprised you, when you did something that seemed out of character. Maybe you lashed out at someone who didn't deserve it, or you found yourself being petty or vindictive, or you suddenly became desperate for attention or approval. Instead of dismissing these moments as anomalies or beating yourself up for them, Consider what your shadow was trying to express. These shadow eruptions are actually gifts, even though they don't feel like it at the time. They're your psyche's way of showing you what you've been repressing, what needs attention, what's seeking integration. The parts of yourself that seem most alien, most unacceptable, often contain the very qualities you need to become whole. Your shadow also emerges in your dreams and fantasies. The characters you dream about, especially the ones you judge or fear, often represent disowned aspects of yourself. The scenarios your mind creates when you're daydreaming or letting your thoughts wander freely are messages from your unconscious about what you're craving, what you're avoiding, what you're ready to integrate. But integration isn't just about accepting your darker impulses. Your shadow also contains your disowned light, the positive qualities you've rejected because they felt too big, too powerful, too risky to own. The confidence you've suppressed because you were told it was arrogance. The creativity you've abandoned because you were told it wasn't practical. The leadership qualities you've hidden because you were told they were too much. Many people find it easier to acknowledge their dark shadow than their golden shadow. It's somehow more comfortable to admit you're selfish than to acknowledge you're brilliant. It's safer to own your anger than to claim your power. It's less threatening to accept your neediness than to recognize your capacity to lead and inspire others. But both aspects of your shadow must be integrated for you to become whole. You must reclaim not just what you've deemed bad about yourself, but also what you've deemed too good, too powerful, too magnificent to own. Your shadow contains your rejected magnificence as much as your rejected darkness. The process of integration begins with radical honesty. You must be willing to see yourself clearly, without the protective filters of self-justification and denial. This means acknowledging that you're capable of the same behaviors you judge in others. It means admitting that you have needs, desires, and impulses that don't fit your idealized self-image. This honesty isn't self-attack, it's self-compassion. It's recognizing that you're human, that you contain multitudes, that your complexity is not a flaw but a feature. It's understanding that your shadows developed for good reasons. They were survival strategies that helped you navigate a world that didn't feel safe for your authentic expression. Your shadow formed in childhood, when you learned which parts of yourself were acceptable to your caregivers, and which parts threatened your belonging. The anger you suppressed because it scared your parents, the sadness you hid because it made others uncomfortable, the joy you muted because it was too much for others to handle, the intelligence you dimmed because it threatened others' egos. These adaptations were necessary at the time. They helped you survive. But what served you as a child may be limiting you as an adult. The strategies that kept you safe in your family of origin might be preventing you from being authentic in your adult relationships. Integration requires grieving. You must mourn the parts of yourself you lost, the years you spent in exile from your own nature, the relationships you couldn't fully participate in because you weren't fully present. This grief is sacred. It honors what was sacrificed and creates space for what wants to be born. As you begin to integrate your shadow, you'll notice changes in how you relate to others. People who used to trigger you will become less activating, not because they've changed, but because you're no longer projecting your disowned material onto them. You'll start to see them as separate individuals rather than screens for your own unconscious content. Your relationships will become more authentic because you'll be bringing more of yourself to them. Instead of relating from your carefully constructed persona, you'll be relating from your genuine self, including the parts you used to hide. This might initially feel uncomfortable or risky, but it's the foundation of real intimacy. Some people in your life might resist your integration process. They were comfortable with your persona, with the predictable role you played in their lives. When you start expressing parts of yourself you've kept hidden, when you start setting boundaries you never set before, when you start honoring needs you've always ignored, some people might push back. This resistance from others is often a sign that you're on the right track. The people who truly care about you will adjust to your greater authenticity, even if it takes time. The people who can't handle your wholeness were probably only comfortable with your brokenness, and that's information worth having. Integration also changes your relationship with your emotions. Instead of seeing feelings as problems to be solved or enemies to be defeated, you begin to understand them as allies and guides. Your anger becomes a signal that your boundaries are being crossed. Your sadness becomes a call for compassion and connection. Your fear becomes information about what matters to you. You stop trying to be positive all the time and start trying to be real all the time. You recognize that authentic positivity can only emerge from acknowledged negativity, that genuine joy can only arise from embraced sorrow, that true strength can only develop from owned vulnerability. The signs of shadow integration begin to appear in subtle but profound ways. You find yourself less reactive to others' behavior. You discover that you're judging people less harshly because you've extended more compassion to yourself. You notice that you're more comfortable with your own contradictions, more accepting of your own complexity. You start to access energy that was previously tied up in repression and denial. The effort it took to maintain your persona, to suppress your shadow, to keep up appearances, that energy becomes available for creative expression, authentic relationship, and purposeful action. Your intuition becomes clearer because you're no longer filtering your perceptions through the lens of what you think you should be feeling or thinking. You can trust your gut reactions because you've made peace with all the parts of yourself that generate those reactions. You begin to understand that your struggles with others are often struggles with yourself. Your conflicts with the world are conflicts with your own nature. Your resistance to certain types of people is resistance to certain aspects of yourself. This understanding doesn't make you passive or accepting of genuine mistreatment, but it does help you distinguish between external problems that need addressing and internal problems that need integrating. The integration process isn't linear. You don't work through your shadow once and then move on. It's an ongoing relationship, a continuous conversation between your conscious awareness and your unconscious depths. New layers of shadow material will emerge as you grow and change, as you encounter new life circumstances, as you're ready to handle deeper levels of truth about yourself. But with each round of integration, you become more whole, more authentic, more alive. You stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be complete. You stop trying to be good and start trying to be real. You stop trying to be acceptable and start trying to be yourself. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you really are rather than who you think you should be. It's not a destination, but a way of living, a commitment to ongoing growth and self-discovery, a willingness to keep facing the unknown parts of yourself with curiosity and compassion. The paradox of shadow work is that by embracing what you've deemed unacceptable about yourself, you become more acceptable to others. By owning what you've considered your worst qualities, you gain access to your best qualities. By making peace with your darkness, you can finally access your authentic light. Your shadow integration is not just personal healing, it's a gift to the world. When you stop projecting your unconscious material onto others, you contribute to the collective healing of human consciousness. When you take responsibility for your own wholeness, you create space for others to do the same. The awakening to your shadow's influence is just the beginning. The real work, the real transformation, happens in the integration, in the ongoing process of bringing consciousness to what has been unconscious, love to what has been rejected, and acceptance to what has been denied. Something extraordinary happens when you stop fighting with yourself. The war that's been raging in your psyche for years suddenly ceases. The energy you've been using to suppress, deny, and hide parts of yourself becomes available for living. You wake up one morning and realize that the person you've been trying so hard to be is far less interesting than the person you actually are. Can you remember the last time you felt truly alive? Not happy, not content, not even successful, but genuinely alive, like electricity was running through your veins, like you were exactly where you belonged, being exactly who you were meant to be. If you're struggling to remember, it's because you've been living from your persona instead of your authentic self. You've been performing life instead of experiencing it. When your shadow no longer dominates your energy, when you've integrated these rejected parts of yourself back into consciousness, life becomes fundamentally different. You stop feeling like you're watching your life from the outside and start living it from the inside. You stop being a character in someone else's story and start being the author of your own. The first sign of this transformation is a profound shift in your relationships. People who used to trigger you now seem almost boring in their predictability, not because you've become superior or detached, but because you're no longer unconsciously battling with yourself through them. That coworker who always irritated you with their attention-seeking behavior, you can now see their pain without taking it on. You recognize their desperate need to be noticed because you've acknowledged your own need to be seen. But more than just reducing conflict, integration creates space for genuine intimacy. When you're not constantly managing your image, when you're not terrified of someone seeing the parts of yourself you've deemed unacceptable, you can actually be present with others. You can listen without planning your defense. You can be vulnerable without feeling like you're going to die. Your relationships deepen because you're bringing your whole self to them, not just the carefully curated version you think others can handle. You discover that most people are actually hungry for this kind of authenticity. They're tired of surface-level interactions and polite performances. They want to connect with who you really are, not who you think you should be. The people who can't handle your wholeness reveal themselves clearly. They preferred you diminished, playing small, staying in the box they built for you. Their discomfort with your authenticity isn't your problem to solve. It's information about the nature of your relationship. Real love doesn't require you to amputate parts of yourself. Real love sees your shadows and says, "I choose you anyway." Your relationship with yourself undergoes the most dramatic transformation. The internal critic that used to run commentary on everything you did begins to quiet down, not because you've become perfect, but because you've made peace with your imperfection. You stop trying to be someone you're not and start being curious about who you are. This shift changes how you move through the world. You walk differently when you're not carrying the weight of self-rejection. You speak differently when you're not monitoring every
word for acceptability. You breathe differently when you're not holding your breath waiting for the next judgment, the next criticism, the next sign that you're not enough. Your decision-making becomes clearer because you're no longer filtering every choice through the question, "What will others think?" Instead, you ask, "What feels true to me? What honors my authentic self? What serves my growth and the growth of those I care about?" These questions lead to very different answers than the ones driven by fear and people-pleasing. You start saying no to things that don't align with your values, even when it disappoints others. You start saying yes to opportunities that excite you, even when they scare you. You begin to trust your instincts because you've made peace with all the parts of yourself that generate those instincts. The energy that was once consumed by internal warfare becomes available for creativity, for passion, for purpose. You discover interests you'd forgotten you had, talents you'd convinced yourself you didn't possess, dreams you'd buried under layers of practicality and other people's expectations. Your shadow contained not just your rejected darkness, but your disowned gifts, and now those gifts are available to you again. You become more comfortable with contradiction. You can be both strong and vulnerable, both confident and uncertain, both generous and self-caring. You recognize that being human means containing multitudes, and you stop trying to resolve the tensions that make you complex and interesting. You embrace the paradox of being both saint and sinner, both wise and foolish, both powerful and powerless. This integration shows up in your emotional life as well. You're no longer afraid of your feelings because you understand them as messengers rather than enemies. Your anger becomes a compass pointing toward your violated boundaries. Your sadness becomes a call for compassion and connection. Your fear becomes information about what you value and what you're ready to protect. You stop trying to be positive all the time and start being real all the time. You recognize that authentic joy can only emerge from acknowledged sorrow, that genuine strength can only develop from owned vulnerability, that true confidence can only arise from accepted uncertainty. Your intuition becomes a reliable guide because you're no longer second-guessing every instinct that doesn't fit your idealized self-image. You can trust your gut reactions because you've made peace with the parts of yourself that generate those reactions. You know the difference between shadow impulses that need integration and wisdom that needs honoring. The quality of your attention changes dramatically. When you're not constantly monitoring yourself for signs of unacceptability, when you're not perpetually braced for criticism or rejection, you can actually be present to what's happening around you. You can fully engage with your work, your relationships, your creative pursuits, your spiritual practice. You start to notice beauty you'd been too distracted to see, opportunities you'd been too fearful to recognize, connections you'd been too defended to make. Life becomes richer, not because your circumstances have changed, but because you're finally available to experience them fully. Your relationship with power transforms completely. When your shadow was running the show, you either gave your power away to avoid conflict, or wielded it destructively to get your unconscious needs met. Now you can access your personal power consciously and use it constructively. You can be strong without being aggressive, assertive without being cruel, confident without being arrogant. You understand that true power comes from wholeness, not from perfection. It comes from accepting all aspects of yourself
and choosing consciously how to express them. You can be fierce when protection is needed and gentle when healing is called for. You can be a warrior and a nurturer, a leader and a follower, a teacher and a student. Your relationship with success and failure also shifts. You stop seeing failure as evidence of your inadequacy and start seeing it as information about what isn't working. You stop seeing success as proof of your worth and start seeing it as a natural result of aligned action. Both success and failure become data points in your ongoing experiment of living authentically. You become more resilient because you're no longer brittle. When you were maintaining a perfect image, any crack felt like total destruction. Now that you've acknowledged your flaws and limitations, you can handle setbacks without falling apart. You understand that being human means making mistakes, and making mistakes doesn't make you unworthy of love or success. The signs of shadow integration become visible to others, even when you're not trying to demonstrate them. People comment that you seem more relaxed, more genuine, more present. They say you're easier to be around, more interesting to talk to, more trustworthy to confide in. They might not be able to articulate what's different about you, but they can sense that you're more solid, more real, more yourself. Your communication becomes clearer because you're not hiding behind layers of defense and pretense. You can speak your truth without attacking others. You can disagree without becoming disagreeable. You can express your needs without manipulation or demand. You can set boundaries without building walls. You start to see other people's shadows with compassion rather than judgment. You recognize their projections, their defense mechanisms, their unconscious patterns, not to use against them, but to understand them more fully. You know that their criticism of you says more about what they can't accept in themselves than about who you actually are. This doesn't make you passive or accepting of mistreatment. Instead, it makes you skillful in your responses. You can address problematic behavior without attacking the person's character. You can protect yourself without demonizing others. You can maintain your boundaries without going to war. Your sense of purpose becomes clearer because you're no longer trying to live someone else's idea of a meaningful life. You can distinguish between what you genuinely care about and what you think you should care about. You can pursue goals that arise from your authentic interests rather than your need for approval or recognition. You begin to understand that your unique combination of gifts and shadows, strengths and vulnerabilities, experiences and insights is exactly what the world needs from you. Not a perfect version of yourself, not a copy of someone else, but the authentic, integrated, fully alive person you were always meant to be. The transformation isn't complete, it's ongoing. Shadow work isn't a problem you solve once and forget about. It's a relationship you maintain, a conversation you continue, a practice you return to whenever you notice yourself falling back into old patterns of self-rejection and projection. But now you have the tools. You understand how projection works. You can recognize when your shadow is activated. You know how to bring consciousness to unconscious patterns. You can choose integration over repression, authenticity over performance, wholeness over perfection. You realize that every person you meet is fighting the same battle you've been fighting, the battle between who they think they should be and who they actually are. You understand that everyone is carrying shadows they're afraid to acknowledge, gifts they're afraid to claim, truths they're afraid to speak. This understanding changes how you move through the world. You become a space of acceptance for others' shadows, a mirror that reflects their wholeness rather than their fragmentation. You stop trying to fix or change people and start creating conditions where they can heal and integrate themselves. Your very presence becomes healing because you're no longer projecting your unconscious material onto others. You're no longer asking them to carry parts of yourself you can't accept. You're no longer trying to get from them what you're not willing to give to yourself. This is your gift to the world, not your perfection, but your integration. Not your strength, but your wholeness. Not your answers, but your willingness to keep asking questions. Not your light, but your acceptance of both light and darkness as necessary aspects of being human. The journey from shadow domination to shadow integration is the journey from fragmentation to wholeness, from performance to authenticity, from survival to aliveness. It's the difference between existing and living, between reacting and responding, between being driven by unconscious forces and being guided by conscious choice. Your shadow was never your enemy. It was your teacher, your guide, your path to freedom. It contained everything you needed to become whole, but you had to be willing to face what you'd been avoiding, own what you'd been denying, and love what you'd been rejecting. This is the ultimate liberation, not from your shadow, but through your shadow, not by becoming perfect, but by becoming complete, not by eliminating your darkness, but by integrating it with your light to create something far more beautiful and powerful than either could be alone. You are no longer at war with yourself. You are no longer performing for others' approval. You are no longer hiding from your own truth. You are finally, fully, authentically alive. The question isn't whether you'll face your shadow. You will, because life will keep presenting you with mirrors until you see clearly. The question is whether you'll face it consciously, with courage and compassion, or whether you'll keep running until running becomes impossible. Your shadow holds the key to your freedom. The parts of yourself you've been most afraid to acknowledge contain the very gifts the world is waiting for you to share. Your wholeness is not just your personal healing, it's your contribution to the healing of human consciousness itself. The choice is yours. You can keep fighting with yourself, keep projecting onto others, keep living from your carefully constructed persona, or you can choose integration, authenticity, and the wild, messy, magnificent experience of being fully human. Your shadow is waiting. Your freedom is waiting. Your authentic self is waiting. What are you waiting for?